The quietness of the land was a language known to Chayton. It spoke in the whisper of the wind across the sparse pines that clung to the hillside, and in the far-off lonesome call of a hawk, gliding beneath a limitless indifferent heaven. It was the same quietness which had accumulated into his and Winona's little, solid cabin, a stillness that was oppressiveness. For 10 years, that silence had been the ghost of the children they had prayed for, a constant hollow chain in the heart of their home. In the year of 1887, their grief was a well-worn stone, smooth and familiar in their hands. They lived apart, nestled in a shallow valley carved by a creek that dried up in the summer and froze hard in winter. They lived a rhythm of survival. Chayton hunting and trapping, his footprints sure and silent on the Dakota ground, and Winona working in her garden, her hands drawing life from the recalcitrant earth. Her understanding of roots and medicine, a legacy of her grandmother's, they moved past each other with the deep unspoken understanding of two individuals who had endured the same long storm. Love was present, deep and enduring, but it was smoothing, colored by sorrow. A garden which had known a permanent frost. That morning, the air had a crispness to it, bearing the first real bite of autumn. Chayton was tightening his line of snares down the creek bed, the sun rising before him, casting long, cold shadows. He walked with an experienced thrift, his senses heightened to the world about him. He registered the new scrape of a deer's hoof, the nervous chatter of a squirrel in the cottonwoods, the way the light lay in the water. It was this sensitivity to the little things which had always kept him stable, which gave him a reason when the bigger ambitions of his heart had died. He had gathered a pair of rabbits when he heard it. It was a thin, reedy call, almost buried in the hum of the creek. He at first waved it away as a kit fox or at a stressed bird. He stopped, head cocked, listening. The call came again, a whimpering, piteous cry that caught on something deep within him. It was not the cry of any creature he had heard. It was too raw, too vulnerable. It sounded half-human. A chill clench of fear knotted in his belly. He left the rabbits where they fell and pursued the sound, his moccasins making no sound on the moist earth. The cries took him downstream toward a thicket of willows where the bank wore away into a shallow gully. There, half concealed in the tall grass, was a coarse burlap bag. It was tied at the top with a length of rough twine, and it was shifting, a small, furious movement from inside. Chayton's heart pounded against his ribs. He edged forward slowly, his hand on the handle of the knife on his belt. The odor that greeted him was sour, an odor of neglect and fear. The crying had come down to a series of weak, hiccuping mewls. He knelt, his gaze sweeping the surrounding area for any evidence of who had left it here. There was nothing, only the indifferent trees, the flowing water, and this awful living bundle. He pulled his knife out deliberately and cut through the twine. The mouth of the sack fell open. He looked inside, his breath trapped in his throat, his mind unable to register what his eyes were showing him. The silence he had always known was nothing in comparison to the one now raging in his ears. At the bottom of the foul darkness of the sack, wrapped in a thin dirty blanket, were babies, not one but 3. They were impossibly tiny, their skin pale and streaked with cold, their faces pinched and blue around the mouth. They were white babies. Their little chests rose and fell in shallow, shuddering respirations. With the cold morning air struck them, one of them released another faint plaintive wail, a cry so bundled with hopeless misery that it cut through Chayton's numbness and reached him to the very center. He was immobile for a long moment, the world spinning on its side. He stared up at the vacant sky, then back at the unfeasible vision before him. This was not his world. This was a sorrow from the white man's town, a sadistic secret left in the wilderness to be washed away by the elements. The reaction was a hard, cold pragmatism. This was a risk he could not take. Stealing these children would bring a world of trouble, which he and Winona had purposefully constructed. Their lives to escape, he ought to walk away. He ought to cover the sack and leave the wilderness to do what it was designed to do. But then he glanced at their faces. He saw a small hand, smaller than a leaf, clench and release. He saw the flutter of eyelashes against a pale cheek. He thought of Winona. He remembered the 10 years of midnight tears she had cried into her pillow, of the cradle he had made for their first hope, which now collected dust in their cabin rafters. This was a cruel joke of the spirits, a bitter irony. Or maybe it was something more completely. He couldn't leave them, no matter what it cost, no matter what the risk. He couldn't be the man who turned his back and walked away and let them die. With a determination that rooted in his bones, Chayton carefully folded the edges of the meager blanket, lifting the 3 tiny, delicate bodies from their macabre holder. They were so light, their combined weight less than a small bag of flour. Had rattled them in his chest, their soft heat a dying flame against his own, and headed home. He did not trend, but his strides were long, and he moved with a sense of urgency, covering the space back to the cabin, back to the woman at the center of his universe, burdened by what he knew would alter everything. Winona was scraper carrots off her garden when she noticed him approaching. She stood up, drying her soil-covered hands on her apron, a question in her eyes. She had expected to find him with game, but he was empty-handed aside from the odd bulky package he held so cautiously in his arms. His face was a mask of stone, yet she knew him better more than she recognized her own face. She noticed the anguish in the angle of his jaw, the intense struggle in his dark eyes. "Chayton," she called, her tone gentle. "What is it? Are you injured?" He did not respond until he stood facing her on the little swept earth area that was their porch. He gazed at her, his eyes fixed on hers, readying her. Then he slowly pushed back a corner off the blanket. Winona's breath escaped her body in a soundless gasp. Her eyes went wide, first with incredulity, then with a slow, dawning, horrified understanding. She saw the 3 small white faces, the limp limbs, the complete helplessness. Her hand shot to her lips, and for an instant the world reeled before her. All the years of yearning, of bare arms and an empty womb, hastened to greet this impossible, desolate reality. These were the ghosts of her own lost dreams, fleshed out and given blood and allowed to die. "The spirits are cruel," she breathed, her voice shaking. Her initial reaction was a flash of the old familiar sorrow, so acute that it felt like a bodily injury. Why display her this? Why take her the one thing she might never have, only to offer Aiton the state of tragic desolation? But as she gazed, the pain started to change. It dissolved before a bitter, hot tide of something else. It was not pity. It was a primal, defensive anger. She did not see the color off their flesh, nor the terms of their coming. She saw only life, flickering and tenuous, about to be snuffed out. She extended her hand, her fingers still chilled from the earth of the garden, softly tracing the cheek of the smallest infant. The flesh felt cold. "Take them in," she said, no longer shaking, but with a new, unshakable firmness in her voice. The question of what to do, of whether to keep them, never existed in her head. They were here. They were alive. Her reason, once so engrossed in mystery for so long, was now glaringly obvious. We had to get them warmed up fast. The cabin, this sanctuary of quiet grief, suddenly became a furnace of frantic energy. Winona commended Chayton with a sharp, decisive vitality he had not witnessed in her for years. They laid the children on a warm buffalo robe beside the fire where a low blaze already crackled. Winona carefully unwrapped them from the dirty blanket, clucking at the thin, bony bodies of them, their skin chafed and raw in spots. There were 2 boys and a girl. She worked with a tenderness that was tragic to see, washing them gently in warm water and soft fabrics. Her fingers moving with an animal instinct she didn't realize she had. Chayton stoked up the fire, his movements sharp and effective, his mind fevered. Heat waster swore. The second was much harder. They require milk, he said, saying the obvious, the words loaded with the almost impossibility of their circumstances. I know, Winona said, her attention completely on Thebabes. She had swaddled them in the finest linen she possessed, clothes she had saved for a future that never materialized. She bundled them together to share body heat, their little heads nearly touching. The Prescotts, their goat, just kidded. They might have surplus milk. Chayton's expression hardened. The Prescotts were white settlers, homesteaders who lived taught themselves a few miles to the east. They were not cruel, but they distrusted like all the others. Approaching them with 3 deserted white infants was a risk. It was an offer to ask questions they could not answer, to harbor suspicions that could curdle into something threatening. Winona, he started, his voice low. You know what they will say, what they will think. She glanced up at him then, and the flame in her eyes burned hotter than the fire in the hearth. They are dying, Chayton. Do their thoughts count for more than this? She waved her hand toward the 3 little bundles, one of whom was now stirring, its mouth opening and closing in a desperate searching motion. I have been silent in my grief for 10 years. I will not be silent now while a child starves in my home. If you will not go, I will. He saw in her face not just a wife he loved, but a woman reborn. The quiet resignation was gone, replaced by fury of a mother bear protecting her cubs. He knew in that instant that he would ride into the white man's fort and fight a legion of blue-coated soldiers if she demanded it of him. Her cause was his now. I will go, he said quietly. He took his water skin and a little leather pouch for the milk. He stopped at Theodore, gazing back at her. She knelt by the fire, softly humming a low, ancient lullaby, a song she had never had any reason to sing before. The vision sent a powerful surge of hope mixed with terror through him. He was a man walking into a storm with no notion at all whether it would pass or sweep everything he loved away. The ride to the Prescott homestead wastens. There was a menace in every shadow. There was the sound of accusation in every gust of wind. Chayton practiced what he would say. He would be straightforward, uncomplicated. He would propose to barter, to work. He would not say more than he had to. When he came to the Prescott farm, Amos Prescott was outside by his barn, repairing a fence post. He was a slender man with pale eyes and a beard grayer than brown. He glanced up, his hand on the axe at his side, his eyes wary. Chayton, he said, his tone flat. It was not so much a greeting as a recognition. Mr. Prescott, Chayton answered, climbing down slowly, his hands in plain sight. I have come at a request a favor, a trade. Prescott's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. What sort of trade? Milk, goats. Milk? Your nanny just gave birth? I have heard. The farmer's suspicion grew stronger. Milk? Why? Your wife? He let it trail off, the implied question left floating in the air. He knew, as the entire sparse community knew, that Chayton and Winona had no children. Chayton met his eye and did not flinch. He would not lie, but he would not provide the entire truth either. We have nido fit for the young, very young. He drew out a good rabbit pelt from his saddlebag. This for a pail of milk and more tomorrow. Amos Prescott regarded him for a long, wordless minute. He glanced at the pelt and then back at Chayton's stoic, unreadable face. He was hard but not cruel. He detected the urgency behind the impassive exterior, the faint tremor of desperation that Chayton could not quite hide. Something was amiss, but it was none of his concern to snoop. Not when a square deal was being proposed, Martha, He shouted towards the house. Fetch a clean pail for our neighbor. Handled the pelt away from Chayton. The milk is thick. You will have to dilute it with water for the newborn. Chayton's heart skipped Alaric. Yes, thank you. He had not realized that. It was the first act of grace in a day of upheaval, a small utilitarian kindness that seemed epic. He rode back with the precious pail of milk bouncing lightly from his saddle horn, a fleeting triumph that served only to emphasize a long, uncertain war ahead. The days that followed merged into a cycle of exhaustion and ceaseless attention. The cabin was revolutionized. The silence was replaced by the shrill, insistent wails of the babies. The slow, reliable pattern of Chayton and Winona's existence was broken, replaced by a never-ending cycle of warming milk, feeding, cleaning, and attempting to calm the inappropriate. They could distinguish the cries from one another. The girl Winona called Atuka, which means blossom, had a fretful, insistent wail. The older boy who named Kanji for the raven had a lusty, demanding cry. The youngest boy was the quietest. He was weak and his grip on life seemed precarious. Winona named him Tio for staying, praying that he would decide to stay with them. Sleep was a luxury, stolen in short moments. Chayton would take a shift, cradling a wailing baby in his wide chest, feeling the light, trembling flutter of its life, and he would be overcome by a burst of fierce protectiveness that surprised him. He saw Winona, and it was as if seeing the sun emerge from behind 10 years of clouds. The pain had been seared out of her eyes, replaced by a watchful, unflagging love. She wasted away from fatigue, but her spirit apparato spread, filling all the nooks of their little house. The cradle he had met years before was lowered from the rafters. It was not large enough for 3, Southie huddled together in a padded box beside the fire, a small knot of arms. Their frugal tranquility, however, was doomed. Rumor of Chayton's daily journeys for milk got around, as rumor always does in remote areas. First, it was on the Curious City. Suspicion then took hold. A week later, after discovering the babies, the town sheriff, Henry Shaw, rode out to their valley. He was a big man who wore his authority like a bulky coat, and he did not dismount at once, his eyes surveying the small homestead critically. Chayton greeted him outside, standing him between the door and the visitor. Winona was within, and he heard the gentle hum of her voice as she nursed one of the children. Chayton, sheriff said, his tone lacking warmth. Heard someone talk about you purchasing goat's milk daily. It is not prohibited to purchase milk, Sheriff, Chayton said, his tone even. It is when a man and his wife with no kids unexpectedly require a litter's worth of milk. Shaw responded, I'm here to view what you've got in there that everyone in the county has been whispering about. Chayton remained firm. This is my house, and this is my jurisdiction, said the sheriff, swinging his bulky frame down off of his horse. I'm entering inside either by your leave or without it. No choice was given. To fight would be to validate every hopeless fear they could have. Chayton moved aside, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Sheriff Shaw pushed the cabin door open and halted dead on the doorstep. The sight before him was one of plain domesticity. The cabin was neat, the fire low and warm. And there on the buffalo robe was Winona softly burping a small pale-skinned infant. 2 other babies slept peacefully in the crate next to her. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke, herbs, and warm milk. The sheriff's face went through a progression of emotions, shock, confusion, and finally a hardening, deep suspicion. He gazed from the white babies at the dark-skinned woman tending to them, and then at Chayton, who stood motionless by the door. In God's name, he breathed, where did you find them? We discovered them, Chayton replied. By the creek. Abandoned. The sheriff's eyes grew narrow. And you didn't take the time to report it, to bring them into town? They were dying, Winona said, her words clear and firm, though Chayton knew her heart would be racing. The town is a day and a half's ride. They would not have survived it. They required warmth and food straight away. We provided it to them. Sheriff Shaw went deeper into the room, his boots thudding against the wooden floorboards. Hal looked down at the babies, his face stern. These are white babies. They don't belong here with you. Winona's head jerked up, her eyes blazing. They belong with those who will keep them alive. They belong with those who love them. We are those people. The sheriff was surprised at her passion. He scanned the little cabin once more at the tidy piles of linen for the babies, the tiny pot of diluted milk heating at the fire. There was no evidence of anything except concern here. Nevertheless, the facts were disturbing. There's a man in town, he said slowly, as if to himself. Garrett Vance, influential man, owns the large ranch south of here. One of his serving maids went missing about a week ago. They said she wasn't the family way. He gazed at Chayton. He's been questioning people, spreading the word that he's searching for her. A sick fear swept over Chayton. He had seen Vance in town. A man with a cruel lip and eyes that did not miss anything. If these kids were his, he would not be searching for them out of concern as a father. He would be searching to lay Iskret to rest. We don't know this guy or his slave, Chayton said. The sheriff fronted, his eyes resting on the children. Perhaps, perhaps not. But if Vance hears about this, he's not the sort of man who enjoys complications. He turned to leave, standing by the door. You're skating on thin ice here. I'm not accusing you of stealing them. Not yet. You should have brought them in, though. This entire thing, it just isn't right. When he was away, a suspenseful silence descended on the cabin. A silence much more ominous than the one that was a product of loss. They were no longer simply saving 3 lives. They were now protecting them from a world which would not comprehend, and from one man who could I wish them ill. He will arrive, Winona whispered, her arms closing around the baby in her arms. I know, Chayton replied, going to bar the door. Let him. The shadow of Garrett Vance loomed over them like a cumulus cloud, heavy with thunder. Chayton started taking measures. He slept little, his gun always handy. By day, he worked near the cabin, his ears tuned in to the creak of arriving horses. He instructed Winona how to reload and shoot the old shotgun they had on hand. Her hands unexpectedly steady, her eyes firm. They were no longer 2 people. They were a family forged in extremity and united by a shared protective love. The children were getting stronger. Under Winona's unrelenting care, their skin lost its shallow color and flushed with health dot, their wails grew stronger, their movements more vigorous. Tio, the youngest boy, had a reserved, observant nature. Kanji was loud and powerful, and little Oka had a smile that could sunder a man's heart in 2. They were being people, their individual spirits unfolding like seedlings in death spring. For Chayton and Winona, that love for them was a raging elemental power, love that had been dammed up for 10 years and was now unleashed with unbridled strength. Some 2 weeks from the day the sheriff came by, the storm swept. It was around sundown. The sky is bruised with purple and orange. A single rider rode towards the cabin. He was Garrett Vance. He was a large man on an amphine black horse, attired in garb that bespoke riches and haughtiness. He did not greet the cabin, but remained seated upon his horse for a considerable time, his chill eyes scanning the humble homestead with disdain. Chayton greeted him outside, rifle slung loosely yet at hand at his side. You are not welcome here, Vance, he declared, voice low and unflinching. Vance sneered, a cold curl of his lip. I'm not here for your courtesy. I'm here for my property. His eyes danced towards the cabin door. The sheriff talks too much. I hear you discovered something that is mine. We discovered 3 children abandoned to die, Chayton clarified. They belong to no one but themselves. They are the result of a stupid girl who worked for me, Vance replied, his voice dripping with venom. A mistake that should have been erased. I've come to correct that error. Give him to me. No, Chayton said. The word was flat, absolute. Vance's face darkened with rage. You think you can defy me, an ignorant savage living in a mud hut? I will have those brats, and I will burn this fell to the ground with you and your squire inside it. He spurred his horse forward to ride down, but before he could move, the cabin door swung open. Winona stood there, the old shotgun clutched in her hands, its twin barrels trained squarely on Vance's chest. Her face was tranquil, but her eyes burned with a cold fire. You will not lay hands on our children, she said, her voice ringing with a power that froze the big man in his tracks. Vance stood there for a moment, taken aback by her defiance. Helod, a harsh, cruel sound. You think that old scattergun intimidates me? There's only 2 of you. I'll be back with my men, and we'll see how much courage you have then. He turned his horse around and galloped off. His final words, an open threat of violence. Chayton and Winona stood and watched him leave, the twilight hours gathering darkness around them. They did not need to talk. They both understood that the battle was not yet finished. It was just beginning. They stood guard for the night, alternately watching the perimeter. The children slumbered unknowingly, oblivious to threat that ranged their tiny, vulnerable world. Chayton shivered with cold resolve to settle over him. He had lived his life shunning the white man's violence, but it was now knocking on his door. He would not flee from it. He would face it. For Winona and for the 3 small souls who had revived the light in their lives. Just after dawn, they heard the horses, not one but several. Chayton moved back by the window, rifle at the ready. Winona stood in the rear, shotgun clutched. The children huddled safely in the root cellar under the floorboards. Vance came back with 4 other men, hard-looking ranch hands, who carried rifles like they used them. They spread out, encircling the little cabin. Last chance, Vance bellowed. Release the brats, and we might spare your life. Chayton's reply was the snapping report of his rifle. He didn't mean to kill, but his bullet hit the pommel of Vance's saddle, causing his horse to rear in sudden fury. It was a warning. We will not be easy, Pri. The ranch hands began firing, bullets splatting into the heavy log walls of the cabin. Chayton and Winona responded sparingly, taking care not to throw away any shots. Shot count, keeping their attackers at bay. The siege was a standoff. Vance and his crew had the numbers, but the cabin provided adequate cover. Time, though, was not on their side. As the sun rose higher in the sky, a new noise added to the intermittent gunfire. The thudding of more horses coming hard. Chayton's heart plunged. He believed that Vance had ordered reinforcements, but when the riders appeared over the ridge, he recognized it was Sheriff Shawand Amos Prescott and 3 other settlers. The sheriff pulled back on his horse, his face a blank mask of anger as he surveyed the situation. Vance, he bellowed. What in the hell are you doing? Call off your dogs now. Vance turned, his face twisted in his NL dot. This is none of your business, Shaw. This is a personal matter. Breaking into a man's house is my business? The sheriff bellowed back. He turned to Amos Prescott. You were correct, Amos. He was not inquiring. It was then that Chayton realized. The farmer, having heard the rumor and seen Vance's men ride out, had grown suspicious and had gone for the law. Another small act of decency. Another unexpected grace. They have my property, Vance insisted, waving his arms wildly toward the cabin. They have a Keldron Garrett, the sheriff responded, his tone as cold as steel. The same children whose mother we now know was discovered dead in a ditch 2 miles from your ranch with a broken neck. It appears your personal business is now a murder investigation. The color bleached out of Vance's face. His hired guns exchanged a glance, their allegiance disappearing in the face of a charge of murder. They dropped their rifles. Vance, cornered and alone, Matty on final desperate bid. He pulled out his pistol and fired wildly at the sheriff. Shaw was faster. His own pistol jumped in his hand, and Garrett Vance collapsed from his saddle, a spreading dark stain across his chest. In the ringing quiet that followed, the only noise was the distant, muffled weeping of a baby from under the cabin floor. The aftermath was quiet. The sheriff and his rump post arrested Vance's men. He approached the cabin, his face tired. Chayton and Winona appeared, blinking in the blinding sunlight. Shaw regarded them, then regarded the solid log walls with bullet holes. "You should have come to me," he said, but his words lacked heat. "Would you have believed us?" Chayton asked somberly. The sheriff had the decency to look embarrassed. He did not reply directly. "The circuit judge will be through next month. We'll have to sort out the legalities of this about the children." He looked over at Amos Prescott, who was watching Winona as she lifted the children one by one from the cellar. "Soothing their frightened cries, seems to me," the farmer said, his voice rough with emotion, "that the matter's already sorted. A parent is the one who raises the child, not the one who sires it aside. Those are their children." He gestured toward Chayton and Winona, a sign of simple, deep respect. Sheriff Shaw viewed the sight before him. The fierce, proud Lakota woman silencing the 3 little white infants, and the quiet, firm man watching over them all. He saw truth in Prescott's statement. Some things were more basic than laws on paper. "Yes," he said, his voice lower than Chayton had ever heard it. "I guess they are." Over the succeeding years, the valley was Tire Haven. The distrust of the town never completely disappeared, but it gradually relaxed into a sort of reluctant acceptance, then into a silent regard. They were the Indian woman and man with the white children, an odd and wonderful family that had held fast. Chayton and Winona raised the 3 children as if they were their own, instructing them in the Lakota language and ways of the land, yet also readying them for the white world they had originated from. Their house was once again filled with sounds. It was filled with the commotion of scraped knees, the ringing laughter, and the ever-vibrant beat of life. One night years later, when the children were grown enough to run unattended across the valley, Chayton stood beside Winona, watching the sun dip behind the hills. Kanji and Tio were skipping stones across the creek, and Oko was braiding wildflowers into her mother's hair. The 10 years off silence seemed a lifetime ago, a memory of another world. Winona rested her head on his shoulder, her hand brushing against his. "The spirits were kind that day," she whispered. Chayton's eyes met the 3 shining, loved faces of his children, his heart overflowing. He thought of the burlap sack, of the frigid fear, of the unthinkable decision. He knew then that family was not a matter of blood or flesh. It was a holy bond, a trust forged in the flames of adversity, and tempered with a love strong enough to stand against the world. "No," Heck concurred, his voice heavy with an emotion he had no words for. "They were not cruel. They were giving us back our lives.